All I require is to sit in the sun, read my book, alone.
I will leave you now to your book.
That is all I ask.
Books, young man, books, thousands of them. If time wasn't so important, I'd show you something. My library, thousands of books.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm the host of this Trek Book Club podcast. This is a companion podcast to the Trek Book Club on Twitter, where we read and discuss Trek books approximately every 6 weeks. To learn more about the club, go to @TrekBookClub on Twitter. For this episode, we will be talking about the TNG novel Imzadi by Peter David, which was the club's discussion novel for April 2023. To help me discuss this novel, we have the co-host of the Star Trek podcast, The Holodeck is Broken, Mac Boyle, joining me today. Hi, Mac. Welcome to the pod, and thanks for joining me to talk about Imzadi.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Peter David's one of my favorites, and just itching to get started.
Okay, great. For our first-time guests, we asked them to give their Trek origin story and their Trek novel origin story. So, Mac, can you start us off by telling us how you got into Star Trek and maybe one of your initial forays into Star Trek novels?
Yeah, I can pinpoint. I became a Star Trek fan in late September of 1993. I can remember this because ABC aired The Voyage Home as their Sunday night movie, and it was the first Trek I had ever taken in. And then about a year later, I was a full-blooded fan, like wanting to go to conventions, and I had the Star Trek encyclopedia in front of me, and all the little minutiae had seeped into my marrow. As far as Trek books were concerned, I'm almost positive the first one I ever read, and I was about that age, I was about 10 at the time, I read Michael Jan Friedman's Reunion. It was actually a book available at one of the Scholastic book fairs. And I was a Star Trek fan, and I was like, yeah, I'll have that, and I read it, and really just became enamored of it, and ate up Trek novels like there was no tomorrow, certainly in the 90s when they were coming out. Like there were like 4 or 5 a month there, right. And it was a golden age. If you talked to 12-year-old me, my dream job would have been writing Trek novels. At about 12, I think I started a zine. I had a mailing list. People I had encountered on AOL chat rooms, and then the zine with what I can only imagine is the most horrible fan fiction that's ever been created. I occasionally get very anxious thinking about somebody finding those stories at some point in the future. And Peter David's always been my favorite. I have this memory of being at a con, I think it was 97 or 98, and he was there. And I brought my copy of The Captain's Daughter for him to sign, and I probably annoyed him a little bit because I had like lots of questions about New Frontier and Q Square and all that, and I was just, he was my favorite of all the Trek writers. So yeah, it's been in my blood for a very, very long time, and it's fun. My podcast deals with a lot of canon Trek. Early on, we had this feature where if I got too into the woods as far as the minutia and the secondary canon and that sort of thing, we actually had a buzzer in our recording room that one of the others could hit, and I'd have to be silent for 20 seconds to take a reflection. We've dropped that feature as I went. We have a pretty good chemistry on the show now, but it's great to talk about those sort of things, the Trek books, the real minutia about Star Trek. So, the Trek Book Club is one of my favorite Twitter accounts to interact with. So
that's great. Well, thank you. Thanks for the kind words. We're really glad that the Trek Book Club has been very helpful and sort of helps develop a community for the fans of Trek who read the novels and gives them a chance to interact every so often. And you mentioned Reunion as your first novel. Is that the one with the Stargazer? With
the Stargazer crew, they're reuniting on the Enterprise D, and one of them's a murderer.
I don't have a whole lot of Star Trek paperback from the 90s that I have, actually. I actually haven't read it, but I do have it because I remember getting that as a gift somewhere in the 90s.
It's been a couple of years since I've reread that one. It'd be really interesting to read that one in the context of what Michael Jan Friedman did later with the whole Stargazer series. Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how books get written before and then it gets followed up later on in a bigger scale. So absolutely.
So yeah, that's great. Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for letting us know. Okay, so for Imzadi, I'll give my disclaimer and a warning about spoilers. So we are recording this episode after Strange New World Season 2, Episode 5, Charades. So just wanted to let everybody know we'll be discussing spoilers related to Imzadi, and we may also touch upon other episodes and novels within the Star Trek universe, similar like what we just did with Reunion. So then the next section, I'm going to just read a short description of the novel Imzadi, and then we'll dive into a discussion. Years before they served together on board the USS Enterprise D, Commander William T. Riker and ship's counselor Deanna Troi had a tempestuous love affair on her home planet of Beta Z. Now their passions have cooled and they serve together as friends. Yet the memories of that time linger, and Riker and Troi remain Imzadi, a powerful Betazoid term that describes the enduring bond they still share. During delicate negotiations with an aggressive race called the Sindarin, Deanna Troi mysteriously falls ill and dies. But her death is only the beginning of the adventure for Commander Riker, an adventure that will take him across time, pit him against one of his closest friends, and force him to choose between Starfleet's strictest rule and the one he calls Imzadi.
That could have gone and been on the back of the book. Yeah. That was great.
yeah. I think that was a kind of good summary of it. So, Mac, what were your initial impressions of the Imzadi novel?
It's a really interesting counterpoint to City on the Edge of Forever, because the whole ethos behind that episode is Kirk has to sacrifice Edith Keeler for the one true timeline, whereas in this one, Riker, arguably selfishly for his own peace of mind and sense of self and love, has to correct the timeline. He happens to be correct in that saving Deanna Troi is the correct timeline, but we can get to that with Commodore Data having a fair point, even though he ends up being the antagonist. The other end of this, there's a decent argument to be made that City on the Edge of Forever really fridges Edith Keeler, and in this story, Riker makes the big sacrifice to save her. Admiral Riker, we say. So it's an interesting companion piece to City on the Edge of Forever. Those are my big picture thoughts. It's hard to not discuss this book without also bringing in The Guardian and the City on the Edge of Forever.
City on the Edge of Forever is actually my favorite Star Trek episode in the entire franchise. So I was pleasantly surprised when I started to read Imzadi to get ready for the book club discussion, and then they say, it just picks up where the end of the City on the Edge of Forever leaves off when Kirk and Spock returns, and then they beam off. And so that was a nice little connection. And like you said, the story of Imzadi is almost like a parallel to the story of City on the Edge of Forever, with the focal points in time, Edith being one of them in the original story, and then Deanna being a focal point in this story. So it was a good parallel between the two. I remember when this book was suggested by the book club members for the poll, when I was doing some research on it, it really got pretty good ratings, positive feedback, was well regarded among the Trek community as a good novel. Now that I've read it, I can say for myself, it's probably within the top 5 for me for the standalone books.
I would definitely put it in top 10, maybe. It's hard to start ranking these a little bit, but when I think of, Peter David's novels, I really love Q Squared. Q Squared is probably number 1 for me, and this would be his number 2 hit, but then again, I love Peter David's work so much that, it probably is pretty close to the top 5, if not quite in that top 5.
So I think for Peter David, we read Q Squared, which, like you said, I also enjoyed. The Squire of Gothos is actually another one of my favorite TOS episodes. So It was nice. They kind of brought Trelane back, although the Trelane in the novel was a bit darker than the Trelane in TOS. And also Vendetta, which I believe is a Peter David novel, was also part of the book club discussions. That was actually one of the first ones that I facilitated a few years ago, and I really enjoyed that book because of the Doomsday Machine is another well-regarded episode. So it was nice to know.
Peter David is really great, especially in that era of Trek Lit, at incorporating pieces of canon that have gone unscrutinized. Your Doomsday Machine, your Trelane, your Guardian of Forever, and really incorporating that into at that point would be modern Trek, TNG's framework. That's always what appealed to me about him. Is there in the New Frontier books, he even brings back Number One, now played by Rebecca Romaine, and recontextualizes her in a really interesting way too. So he's definitely got that runner throughout his work.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I read the first 4 novellas or the mini novels for New Frontier. I think Shelby is back, and then Robin Lefner is returned, but they also have the new characters with Captain Calhoun and others. So, what were your sort of impressions with the Will Deanna relationship? That was one of the key foundations of this book. So from way back in Encounter at Farpoint to Insurrection/Nemesis when they got married, and even to Picard season 3, we see them again and as they are now. So, any initial thoughts about that relationship?
Well, it's really interesting that it's a very deep and fulfilling for the fans to view relationship when it starts off as just a vaguely Xeroxed version of Decker and Ilea from the motion picture. The DNA of that is very clear, not just as an influence, just as they didn't let us do phase 2. Let's try to dust this off and make this an ongoing thing. It's an interesting year to talk about relationships or ships and the Next Generation, especially after Picard season 3 has aired, because if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said, oh gosh, Will and Deanna have their stuff figured out. Let's try to fix Jean-Luc and Beverly. Now that Picard season 3 is over, I'm like, they're all in a good place. It's really interesting, especially with the added context of this novel. Their relationship is, for lack of a better term, very adolescent to start off with. Infatuation, it's lust, it's the pulse-quickening part of romance, and it flames out. They still have very deep feelings for one another. They become really the best of friends in the canon episodes of TNG, and their romance bubbles up again in Insurrection, and they are married in Nemesis. And by the time we see them in Picard season 3, I would struggle to find a depiction of a long married couple that feels more true. Their relationship feels so well lived in by the time we see them on the Shrike in Picard season 3. They can get the better of each other, but it's always loving. They've got each other's back, even when their own emotional baggage may prevent them from being everything they can be for one another. I was very surprised that Picard season 3 would actually turn me into a Will Deanna shipper from a Picard Beverly shipper. I'm okay with Picard and Beverly not ending up together, but as long as Will and Deanna are fine. And so rereading the book in that context, the embittered Admiral Riker is very believable. If he lost Deanna at an early point and was never able to come to grips with his feelings, he would be really half a person. And that also rings true. We talk about the influences of novels to canon. It doesn't feel like the novels influence canon that much, but this novel came out about 2 years before All Good Things came out, and it would be very difficult to not see this book's DNA in the depiction of the anti-time future Admiral Riker there, especially with Deanna having passed away in that timeline too.
When I was reading the book, I had the image of the future Admiral Riker from All Good Things when I was reading his scenes, because look, even the cover had a little bit of that white beard, the gray hair. So yeah, I think there was maybe there could have been a little bit of connection between the two. Similar to yourself, I think for me, I like the Will Deanna relationship. Part of me wanted them to get together. I could understand it would have been hard to have those characters continue, on the show in that way if they had a permanent relationship. So I was happy that by the time Nemesis rolled around, they got married, and then saw them again in Nepenthe and Picard season 1, revisit them, and then having their relationship be discussed more in season 3. So I think this was a good place that they were left off at the end of season 3, pretty much with all the TNG characters by the end of episode 10. So it sounds like their relationship deepened over the events especially in the last episode in The Last Generation.
And really, all the TNG crew is in a good place. That's
Mm-hmm.
the beauty part of that season. Is I was bracing myself for Picard dying,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
others dying.
Yeah, me too.
I was like, okay, I think I can handle it. I think I can handle it. But what Metalis did that was so miraculous, he didn't. He the impulse could have been to give us a funeral for Jean-Luc Picard, but he
Mhm.
didn't. He gave us just a party with them, and
Mhm.
it was really one of the better joys of any media this year, I think.
Yeah. No, I was also bracing for somebody's going to not make it to the end. We just don't know who it was. And I was thinking it would have been Jean-Luc Picard because the actor kind of ready to move on and try to end it. So I thought this would be a good time. I wouldn't have been surprised if they did
Right.
that. But at the same time, I was glad they did not do that and they just left it everybody in a good place. And in case there's been talk of finale TNG movie that Patrick Stewart would express some interest in.
I don't know. They'd be hard to top
Yeah.
this season. So I'd say, hey, leave it be. Let's not do Nemesis Part 2.
Yeah. It ended on a high note and in a way, but you had 10 episodes of 8 hours or something of a good TNG farewell tour. And so this would be a good time. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit more into Imzadi. So when I was thinking of how the structure of the book, I see it more like in 3 parts. So there was the future that started off with the Guardian, as we said, and the future with Admiral Riker. And then we had the middle part, the past, which was the main heart of the book, was when Lieutenant Riker and Deanna Troi first met and their initial relationship. And then we had at the end, which is the present. In TNG, it's somewhere in the era of the TNG era, that was the resolution. So,
Late season 5, early season 6.
Yeah, something like that. So maybe we could just talk a little bit about the future part, and then we'll dive into the heart of it. So in the future, we had Guardian of Forever and Admiral Riker being a very, as you mentioned before, very distraught and just depressed over the decades after Deanna died. We also had Captain Wesley Crusher of the Hood, which was interesting to see. And we had Commodore Data as well. He gets to play like you said, a more antagonist role at the end, but beat him here. So sort of what are your general thoughts about the setup of the novel?
I mean, it starts off with lines directly from City on the Edge of Forever. And so Peter David always has a really great way of putting you off balance at the beginning of his books so that your attention is zeroed in on what's happening. Q Squared did the same thing. It was an interesting future that we don't really ever see. Like, obviously there are shades of that Admiral Riker in All Good Things, but Commodore Data of the Enterprise F is not something we're ever going to see. And Captain Wesley Crusher obviously is pretty antithetical to how Wesley Crusher's story plays out in the canon timeline. Honestly, I like parts of how Wesley ended up in canon, but the problem I think I have with Journey's End in season 7 of TNG is that we don't see Wesley all that often in those last years of TNG, but I have trouble reconciling the very self-assured young teenager we see and encounter at Farpoint who wants to go to the academy and wants to live up to all of these ideals with season 7 Wesley who wants to throw it all away. This Captain Wesley Crusher of the Hood is very much what I would have thought Wesley would have developed as without the First Duty and Journey's End skewing him a little bit. So it's good to see that he lived up to his potential and seems content with that potential.
The scenes with Captain Wesley was sort of some of my favorite scenes from that future section.
So.
When I was reading about Captain Crusher, I was thinking the same thing. I said, oh, this is what the trajectory of the character was going towards up until Final Mission. The later stories in which he was the guest star as opposed to main cast was interesting as well with the First Duty, which is one of my favorite TNG episodes as well. But like you said, that first 4 or 3 plus seasons, I was expecting him to go to the academy. I was expecting him to graduate, be a commissioned officer, and then eventually kind of slowly, move up the ranks. So like, I could see him being a captain eventually and, having these major responsibilities and doing well. So it was nice that the Peter David took like the Wesley that we knew of before Journey's End and before Picard season 2, the Traveler Wesley, and then have him be Starfleet Officer Wesley. So that was a good part of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That whole section with Admiral Riker was interesting because that gave a picture of someone who is broken, who is depressed, who always tried to think about what might have been or what he could have done differently or better, or if he could have prevented what happened to Deanna in that timeline. So just so used to William Riker being a certain way, so having him be opposite of that. And like you said, it reminded me of the All Good Things future Admiral Riker. So I was thinking of that character while I was reading it and just seeing, because they're similar in some respects. And then we had Commodore Data. So he was the captain of the Enterprise. I was kind of happy. I mean, similar to Wesley, and with Data, I also could see him advancing through the ranks, eventually being captain. I remember, was it might have been Redemption, the one with the Klingon Civil War, when
he took command of the Sutherland.
Yeah. So that was the Data in command, and I liked those scenes a lot during that two-parter. So it's like, oh yeah, Data in command. So that would be an interesting arc for that character, because I think he would be interested in that. So it was nice that they acknowledged that here.
Remembering in the Star Trek Countdown comics, the lead up to the J.J. Abrams reboot, had Data as a resurrected Data, because it had Nemesis as canon. Resurrected Data as captain of the Enterprise E at that point. So there's always those references.
Right. Okay. So then we transition into the past. So it was Commodore Data who gave Admiral Riker the clue that Guardian of Forever was showing an alternate timeline in which Deanna was alive. And so Commodore Data thought he was helping him by saying, oh, she's alive. But then Admiral Riker took that and said, oh, I can do something with that. I can go back and change it. And so that starts off the journey of Admiral Riker to try to save Deanna. I think it was Wesley who wanted to know what happened to Lieutenant Riker and Deanna. And so that was the mechanism in which the story flashes back into the past. So Lieutenant Riker, before he was going onto the Hood, I think the Hood was in dry dock for repairs, and so he ended up on Data Z to be on a mission. So that's how we kind of learned. That's how he met Deanna, met Loaxana Troi, her mom, which is a decent section of the story, how they started the relationship and then how they ended it. So what were your thoughts about that whole middle section? There were a lot of things going on, but they were all kind of important things.
Yeah, a lot of important things going on, and seeing a young Riker is interesting because we never really see that in canon. You get shades of that in Thomas Riker because he's sort of emotionally in stasis until they find him there. It was interesting when I remember reading this as a kid. I thought, oh, this is such a romantic fantasy. Like, you meet this girl and she's into you and you're into her, and it so changes your way of thinking. And reading it now, it's like, oh, it's such a shallow, feels pejorative, but there is a shallow quality to the beginnings of their relationship here, at least as far as Will is concerned. Deanna has clearly a lot more emotional intelligence by her nature, that she can sense these things, and that goes into the very issue of what Imzadi is. And it's going to take this lunkhead Riker years to figure out what's happened to him here. He has a sense of it. He's clearly attracted to Deanna, but he has no idea that his life is on a completely different trajectory the moment he has met this woman. And that's the really engaging part. I think you read it from the Imzadi Forever omnibus, correct?
Yes.
And I did too, most recently. But I went into the Internet Archive and found like the first edition of it. It's interesting. Peter David wrote this. You juxtapose the preface that he wrote for the omnibus and the preface he wrote for the initial edition. Interesting trivia, Gene Roddenberry signed off on this origins of Will and Deanna's relationship before he passed away, and said forward reading it but never got to. But the larger point is he dedicates part of the novel to his then wife. By the time he wrote Imzadi 2, that marriage had ended. So he was like, it's an interesting perspective. He has trouble wrapping his head around the context of him writing it, much less who Will is at that point. And Imzadi, too, at its core, more about the end of Deanna and Worf's relationship. If you're looking for a thematic thing, there's a lot of plot in that one, too. But yeah, that's it's really interesting to see a early 20s, we'll guess, Will Riker. And when I was 12, 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there, he was really cool. Who doesn't want to go to this exotic planet and meet a girl and save the day and all that sort of stuff? And now I increasingly feel more like Picard season 3 Riker. Like, can I make pizza and try to be emotionally honest from now on?
So not only did the characters evolve, but we evolve as well over
Absolutely.
20, 30 years. So, yeah, that's interesting points about the background that you mentioned about Peter David with Imzadi 1 and Imzadi 2 and what he was going through in his personal life at that time. So that's interesting. I think for me, like you said, we didn't really know much about Will Riker's backstory. So this gave some context and some information about it. I think Will, at that stage, being young, up and coming, he wanted to be the youngest Starfleet captain. I think that was mentioned somewhere in the novel as well. So he wanted to move through the ranks, and he saw relationships a bit more, not as emotional or permanent. Sounds like he goes and just have relationships one after the other, while Deanna being more studious or looking at the long term. It might be because of also we'll talk about Loaxana in a second, but it could be her relationship with her mom affecting her and how her outlook on what Deanna's future relationships can have a factor in it. So by the time Encounter at Farpoint came around, they were a little bit closer because I think Deanna hadn't changed as much, but I think Will matured a bit compared to Lieutenant Riker. So he had more responsibility, being first officer of the flagship, things like that. So he's more serious. But I think at this stage, young Will Riker, we saw maybe just like that, young adult.
There's more Kirk in him in this younger version.
Yeah.
And it's, the more I think about it, like, as I've grown older, like, you look at me as an adolescent, who doesn't want to be Kirk? The romantic hero, just a girl on every planet. It's all good. Everything's great. And as I've grown older, I've wanted to become more like Picard, studious, quiet. Just let's all just. I think you've got the clip at the beginning of your show from Captain's Holiday. I just would like to set up my book and be left alone. That is very much my energy, and it's interesting. Riker probably read about James T. Kirk and thought of that as the platonic ideal of a Starfleet captain, and unconsciously and unscrutinized wanted to emulate that. But as he meets Jean-Luc Picard, he sees a different way and he calms down. He becomes even more emotionally mature than Jean-Luc Picard in a lot of ways. And that is so fundamental to his later relationship with Deanna.
That's a great point. And in Picard season 3, I think we see Riker sometimes even more mature and more of a leader than Jean-Luc at that stage. There's a few scenes on the Shrike in which that Riker was taking the lead on things. Also, you mentioned something about Captain Kirk. I think when the character of Riker and Picard was being developed in the beginning of TNG, they ended up wanting to split the Captain Kirk role into two, I believe. So Riker had some of Kirk's characteristics, having relationships, being very friendly, and just going on away team missions, while Picard wasn't going on the missions as much, and a little bit more reflective and a little bit more of a sort of a leader, either a mentor or teacher role. Because I think one of the things about TOS Kirk was that Kirk ended up playing both roles, and they wanted to split those into two during when they developed the TNG.
Yeah, and that dynamic again is also a holdover from what was going to be Star Trek Phase 2, but became the motion picture. In the early development of Phase 2, they did not necessarily have Shatner on contract for every episode. So they said, okay, we're going to create a secondary captain character who we can have under contract to play those sort of roles. And if Shatner's there every week, great. We'll have plenty for him to do, but if he's not, we also have this other guy that can fall in love on every planet.
Everything's all interrelated, it seems, with Star Trek. Let's talk a little bit about Loaxana Troi, who's Deanna's mom. We met her in TNG, in Haven. She was in a few episodes, like I remember Dark Page, Half a Life. Those were probably my favorite Loaxana episodes. I actually prefer the serious Loaxana rather than the comedic ones that we saw at the beginning.
It gives her a lot of dimension, On my podcast, when we started with TNG and we saw our first Loaxana episode, the others who aren't as steeped in Star Trek lore and certainly I or my wife we're like, whoa, Loxana's a lot. Like, I don't know if I can handle this if she's coming back a lot. I'm like, you're not wrong, but you have to remember that her personality, her big, overwhelming at times personality is a cover. Not a covered, maybe a strong word, but a dodge.
Reaction. Yeah, like a reaction.
Yeah, because of the amount of anguish she has with her own dead daughter and the late Mr. Troi, Ian Troi, Deanna's father. She has a lot of anguish to her, and that clowning quality she has is all a cover. And I even had that insight at that point that living amongst Betazeds and being a Betazoid herself, her big personality, I wonder, is almost a psychic block, so that other Betazoids don't see what's really going on in her head. If you're a telepath and you're near Loxana Troi, all you're seeing is like, oh my God, Mr. Hum, come here. There's not any air to see what she's actually about. I think Deanna knows better, but everybody else, whether you're telepath or not telepath, she is keeping everybody at just the right amount of distance with the Loxana show.
Yeah, that's a good point. At the beginning, her character was so played as a overbearing or controlling or just or larger than life, and so Picard trying to avoid her whenever she's around, and you had Deanna getting stressed out whenever she's around. Like I said before, in Dark Page and in Half Alive, and also in DS9 when she came back for a couple of episodes, mainly with Odo, I think. Those were really good scenes between.
She and Odo got married for a minute.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Odo is Deanna Troi's stepfather. Yeah. We must never forget this.
I'm glad that Loxana played a big role in this story, because when it comes to Troi's backstory, Loxana plays a big part of it. So she didn't really like Riker at the beginning, but I think that was just kind of natural. I think part of it's jealousy or just father-daughter, not sure about his potential suitor and things like that. So
I think she probably saw a lot of her late husband in him too. Loxana saw Deanna. I think she wanted to protect Deanna from the heartache that she knows she would experience, and that's a very classic sort of parent
child protection. Being protective of their child and not having your child go through something that you went through years ago. So giving Deanna a hard time, she was giving Will a hard time, and so it came out at the end why she was, because she had a similar relationship with her mom when Loxana decided to marry Ian, a human, and going against the wishes of her own mother. So it was a nice, almost a full circle with the character there. Talk really quickly about a couple of the other characters that we meet. We had Mark Roper, who was the head of the embassy or the consulate in the Federation consulate in Betazed. And we also had Sergeant Roger Tang, who was the head of the security detail. So I actually enjoyed the two of them. I mean, they were newer characters. They were, they had smaller roles, but Mark Roper was almost like a confidant or a teacher to Will. And so he encouraged him, and he was a good friendly face for Will. A little bit of a father figure while he was there. Yeah. He
also exhibited some of those laid back qualities that we see in Riker in TNG. Riker is an authority figure on the Enterprise D, but he also is a man of the people, for lack of a better term. He's at 10 Forward. He hosts the poker games. That feels like Roper may have rubbed off on him in that way.
And then Sergeant Roger Tang, I just remember his favorite slogan, just a member of the service, or something like that, when he was quoting a lot. So sort of playing the loyal soldier, being official, following the orders, doing what he has to do to get the job done. So it was nice to have a character like that to help Will while he's on it. For Deanna, I wanted to mention at this time that for me, I always felt that she was one of those characters on TNG in which it was sometimes hard to write for. So if she was the main character in a particular episode, it was a little easier. If the episode wasn't about her, then it was harder to write. So I just remembered in particular Face of the Enemy, in which she was
Face
disguised.
Of the Enemy's great.
Yeah, that was probably my favorite Deanna episode, when she was disguised as a Romulan on an undercover mission. I mean, she was really good in that one. And there was another one called The Loss, in which she lost her telepathic powers temporarily, and she
Yes.
had to adjust how to do that. And those are two that for me were probably my favorite Deanna stories.
If Deanna wasn't the focus of a particular episode, her scenes unfortunately tended to lift right out, because her scenes would be talking about feelings that would inevitably be displayed in some other way later on in the story. Great example is Relics, the episode where Scotty is found. She is barely in the episode at all. In fact, I think she just shows up in the last scene where he leaves. Yeah. But in the original version of the episode, she and Scotty had this whole 5 to 10 minute scene talking about all these feelings that he ends up displaying again later on. Troi fell into this trap where, like you very correctly pointed out, if she's not the focus of the story, she tends to be superfluous. Mm-hmm. And that's a failing of the show, even though it's hard to not love all 7 of those characters.
Winding down the section related to the past, there was a terrorist attack in the, I think, the museum?
Yes,
the museum,
I was just about to say museum. Yeah.
Museum. And then Deanna was taken hostage by, actually, I believe it was a Marine terrorist who will come back at the end. And then Riker goes on a rescue mission and saves her. And then she, being in a relationship after that. And then Roxana and her had an argument. So there were various arguments along the way. And then Riker ended up leaving. Deanna had a quick relationship with Wendy Roper, who was the daughter of Mark Roper. It was someone who, a friend of his as well there. And then Deanna saw them, and then they ended up breaking off their relationship. And so that was the end. So how that whole section, there was a lot of things going on. So I was kind of sad to see that, even though that was implied, I think, in Encounter at Farbar, they haven't really contacted each other for some time. So, but this kind of explains what happened and all the different emotions that was going on during that whole tail end of their time together then.
And it is a little bit retconned by Second Chances, which airs less than a year after this book is out, because that definitely paints a picture of Riker leaving Beta Z still very much hung up on her and determined to reunite with her fairly soon after that. And then it's interesting in Imzadi 2, which was published after TNG was over, Peter David writes a scene where he tries to merge those two continuities a little bit. Like, you cheated on me with Wendy Roper and then left the planet. And he's like, but I was dead set on seeing you again on that planet. And she's like, yes, that's right. Tom did say that a year ago.
That's another Peter David trying to connect the threads, give us a good story then.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like I said, I was a little bit sad to see that happen, even though there was, but I guess that was also another sign of Will being Will, of him still, going from one relationship to another, or just on the rebound. And then Deanna ended up standing up against her mom, and then she went to see him to try to say that he'll stay with him, and then he did that. So she was being very hurt, and then they just broke it off there. So then we flash forward to the present, who I think it was, like you said, it's like around season 5, season 6 of TNG, in which the last quarter of the book, which was focusing on Admiral Riker going back in time to that era, to the season 5 TNG, to meet up with Commander Riker, and between the two of them, stop the assassination attempt on Deanna, and then saving her. So, and also at that time, we see Commodore Data from the future realizing what Admiral Riker from the future is trying to do, which is going back in time to save Deanna. So Commodore Data, and this is where the don't mess with the timeline directive comes in from Starfleet. So Commodore Data then goes back in time to try to stop Admiral Riker and Commander Riker from doing that. So it gets a little confusing, but it was fun.
David novel.
Yeah, but it's a Peter David. But this reminded me of Q Squared, because in Q Squared, I was totally confused at the end when all these different variations of the future and the past characters all were interacting with each other. I had a really hard time, I remember, writing the Trek Book Club discussion questions for Q Squared, because I had no idea how to try to explain who am I referring to at that time. So like you said, that's a Peter David novel. So what'd you think about this section? There was some humor with Barkley was in there. Kind of saw him getting confused with the different things, and we saw Data's head returns as well. So, but there was also the seriousness of Admiral Riker seeing Deanna for first time in 40 or some odd years. So there was a whole gamut of emotions during these chapters.
I think Peter David is never better than when he is leaning into the comedy. I think he wrote a Q versus Loxana book, Q and Law, which is quite good. Several parts of the New Frontier books are just howlingly funny. So that was great to see, that chaos that he can harness for a story. And then, like you mentioned, Admiral Riker seeing Deanna for the first time in so many years, and the friction that he would have with his younger self. I have no trouble imagining that if I encountered my younger self, we might not get along. And then my older self might not get along with me. There's that spectrum going on. That feels very true. And you mentioned Commodore Data really becomes the antagonist, not the villain. He is pure of heart and absolutely. I mean, if I had to be honest with myself, if I was in this story, I would probably side with Data here because there's no way to know what that timeline will mean. And doubly in Data's defense, setting the timeline correct means that he's dead in a couple of years. So the chaos theory inherent in messing with the timeline, Riker's not doing this for the right reasons. He's doing this because he hates who he's become without Deanna, and he wants that back. There's a little bit of ego in there. Yes, there's love, and my God, how can I not try to save the woman I love? But there's also an element of, I'm a basket case, and I would prefer not to be. So can I go back in time and switch tracks there? Yeah, I would be wrong, but I would be wrong with Data. And that's probably the best way to possibly be dead wrong about something.
I could definitely see Data in prime directive type of reasoning as don't mess around with the timeline. You're going to have unforeseen consequences. You're not going to show what's going to be happening. You think you know, you won't know. So you have that. And then on the flip side, then you have Admiral Riker with all the pain that he lived with over the last 40 years, trying to undo it and thinking that he's right. I guess in this way, it's sort of that needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many.
Yeah,
in this case,
Riker's right that the many are being serviced by this, but he's not acting from that place. Data is. And I think that's when TNG is at its best, when you've got two people. It's sort of the measure of a man construction of there is nobody who is a mustache twirling villain other than the Cinderine and the Comaloid that you got here. But they are coming at it from different perspectives, and they're both right. So then it's a playing out of drama to see who comes out on top.
Yeah, those are actually the Star Trek episodes I really enjoyed the most, are those moral quandary or those ethical quandary episodes, like Measure of the Man. Yeah, so then we have Admiral Riker with Commander Riker working together. They identify, like you said, there was a Camaloid who was the first officer of the Enterprise under Data. I think.
That's right.
Yeah, and then so he was uncovered, but then that did not resolve everything. And then later on, it was uncovered that there was, I think, a member of one of the negotiating parties of the Cinderine was from the future. And so he ended up poisoning Deanna. That's how she died in the original timeline. So, or the future one. but that's how she died, because of that poisoning. And so she realized in this time, she realized what was happening, and so they were able to capture him, and then that concluded the story, at least the main part of that story. For me, the Cinderine instigated things, but it wasn't
a
plot device. Yeah, they weren't like a big part of the story, but they were there to kind of keep things going. And so at the end, everything gets restored. So Admiral Riker returns back to the future. Commodore Data with the Cinderine assassin goes back to the future. And then in TNG, present day, Deanna will everybody stays the same. Then Lieutenant Commander Data, who was kind of swapped out with Commodore Data, ended up taking his place. They found him, and then he was helping out as well. And so it gets all returned to normal. So then at the end, it ended up Admiral Riker heard it in his head. I couldn't tell if it was real or not. I interpreted it as real that he heard Deanna's thoughts, like in mentioning "Welcome home, Imzadi," and that's how the book ended. So I think it kind of ended on a high note, because that's where I interpreted it as future Deanna is there, and they could at least meet up and maybe continue the relationship or not, but at least she would be alive.
Yeah, it's. I would almost go a little beyond that and say, because when we think of the canon Prime universe at this point in time is starkly different from the future that's presented at the beginning of the book, I wonder if, in sort of that Back to the Future style, Commodore Data and Admiral Riker arrive in the future, and they are being erased from the timeline because they have starkly different fates in the Prime timeline. But before he's gone, he does know that Deanna is still alive because he has that Imzadi connection.
Okay.
I think that may be part of it too. Is that they're not a grim fate, but like a
sacrifice.
A sacrifice. And Riker really knows that he whoever he is there is not going to exist, but Captain Riker, the famed pizza maker, lives on.
Right, and that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that could very well be. Yeah, so that's pretty much in a relatively nutshell style of the book. So what were your overall general impressions, or anything that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
Yeah, I think my general impressions, it's a different book now than it was when I first read it, and it's still good. It still has that Peter David quality of trying to tie together threads of canon that the shows and the movies aren't necessarily going to revisit. It's an interesting snapshot of young Will, and when you juxtapose that with old Will that we know now, or old Will that is presented here, Riker becomes a much more fleshed out character. That's the great thing about these non-canon novels, is that unless it's specifically retconned, i.e. Wesley Crusher, Captain of the Hood, you can incorporate all these different shades of the characters into the character you see on screen. And it plays really great, and definitely one of the great 90s Trek novels. Yeah.
Agree with you. Like I said, it's one of my top ones. And now that I've read it, I could understand why it's a well-regarded within the community.
Yeah, Peter David even mentioned that it's like his most popular book by far.
Oh, really?
Of all. He writes in a number of genres. He's written some movie novelizations and obviously some comic books. He is the creator of Spider-Man 2099 for Across the Spider-Verse fans. So he's had a long storied career, but this is the big book of his career, and fans approach him about that one more than anything else. So it's definitely at the top of his CV when people talk about his contributions.
Yeah, I think for me, time travel stories, alternate timeline stories, I have a soft spot for them within the Star Trek universe. A lot of my favorite episodes are in that subgenre. So City on the Edge of Forever, A Voyager's Timeless, Enterprise's Twilight.
Timeless especially, I think, has a lot in common with this.
Yes.
You can tie Harry Kim in that episode to Will Riker in this one in a lot of very key ways.
That's a great point. You have the regrets, doing something that you shouldn't have done in Harry's case, and which led to Voyager, everyone dying on Voyager, and then he had a chance, with Chakotay's help, to go back. A little bit of a side tangent, but we were talking about Deanna's character, having a hard time to write for her when she's not the center of the episode. So I think Harry is a similar situation.
Very much so.
Which, when you have an episode like Timeless, in which Harry was a star, it's really great.
Yeah, I remember my history right. The producers, when they were bringing on Jerry Ryan as 7 of 9, they had to cut somebody, and they eventually cut Jennifer Lean as Cass. They were really gearing up because they felt like they had run out of stories to tell with Harry Kim, but Garrett Wang ended up on people's most beautiful list.
100.
Yeah. Well, now we can't fire him, and so he got to stay for the whole ride.
I read somewhere that they were thinking of trying to bring him back for a cameo in Card Season 3.
It's a budget thing from what I heard from Metalis. Yeah, just they couldn't include everything they wanted.
Right, so they had to cut they had to cut something. So
yeah, it's a shame that Paramount Plus is not doing short treks anymore, because it really was a platform you could have done. It doesn't have to be a season-long thing. It doesn't have to be a movie. Give us 15 minutes, Harry Kim, just to see what's up with him.
I was thinking exactly the same thing. And when Short Treks came out and we had those 7 or 8 episodes of Short Treks, I said, oh, this is a great format for these stories in which they don't require a season. They don't even require an hour-long episode, but just 15 minutes just to see what's happening on various corners of the Trek universe.
The early rumors on Discovery is that Brian Fuller wanted to do an anthology show. Like, he was really only wrote Discovery's arc as that first season. And then season 2 of this Discovery was going to be something completely different with a completely different crew, along the lines of an American Horror Story or something, not with that kind of vibe, but tell a completely distinctly different story with every year.
I think an anthology story would give a chance to tell a more variety of stories.
Tell a post Undiscovered Country pre-Farpoint story. You cast somebody as a vaguely middle-aged Curzon Dax and do all sorts of stuff.
Kind of on a related note, the next Trek Book Club discussion is scheduled to be a Lost Era novel, which is
Art of the Possible?
Actually, it's A Well of Souls, which is Enterprise C Captain Rachel Garrett era novel. So I didn't know this until I dug into the nominations for the poll in which the Lost Era novel won. But there's this books that concentrate in that era in which we see other stories with familiar characters. So I think there was a John Harriman novel. There's a Rachel Garrett novel. I think there might have been a Captain Sulu novel. So
there's one with Curzon Dax and Colonel Worf of Star Trek VI, Worf's grandfather. That's Art of the Possible. That's the one I was thinking of.
It's interesting to see those. I'm happy to discover that series. I know we kind of diverge a little bit, but that's okay. It was a good discussion. So, so I really enjoyed it. Like I said, the Imzadi, one of my favorite ones now. You've mentioned Imzadi 2, which I have not read yet, although I do have it in the ebook format. So I think eventually I'd like to read that because it sounds like there's a bit of a tie-in, but a continuation, but bringing in Worf and Tom Riker.
It's more about Deanna and Worf's relationship. I mean, there's that gap. They were together at the end of season 7, and it's never really mentioned until there's some hints of it in Picard season 3. It deals with the culmination of their relationship. It's a good read.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think I'll do that eventually. Mac, was there anything else that you wanted to mention about the novel that we haven't had a chance to talk yet?
Especially reading it this time, I was very tickled by the character of Mary Mack, the science-y, studious Orion administrator of Forever World. And I think we talked about it when we were doing the discussion on Twitter. She has a very proto-Tendi vibe. When you read some of these novels, it's a little hard to picture some of the characters, but when I'm reading it this time, I see Tendi in my head now, and that's a delight.
When I was reading about Mary Mack, it also reminded me of Tendi, so it's good that you get different characters that go against stereotype, like Mary and like Vincent Tendi, and so kind of used to Orion's being a certain way over the years, so to see some exceptions, and it was good that Peter David brought a character such as Mary in.
It's probably worth mentioning to the listeners that Peter David has had kind of a bad run of luck as of late. Yeah. He's reading some of the stuff. He's had a couple of strokes, a heart attack, some kidney failure, and he's having a rough go of it. There's a GoFundMe to help his family out there. So if you're of a mind, if you've enjoyed his books, I think it's pretty fair to say that he's certainly not been remunerated nearly enough for his contributions to our culture. Especially, I mean, Spider-Man 2099 is a big character in a big movie this summer, and he's not seeing a dime of that. If you've enjoyed his work, look that up and see if you can help him.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning it. I'll find it and I'll put reference to that in the show notes. So this way,
I've got a link here. I can send it to you.
Yeah. If you could send that to me, I'll just include that in the show notes. And this way, any of our listeners who's interested can take a look at that. I think we're pretty much at the end. So I just want to thank you, Mac, for being a guest on this podcast. I had a great time with you talking about Imzadi. I brought up a lot of good points, a lot of good background information about the book and about how it fits into the franchise and about the author. So I really appreciate taking the time to come here to talk to us.
It was my pleasure. Like I said, I really enjoy the Twitter discussions that you've been facilitating. It's one of my favorite corners of the internet. So it's been a real pleasure to be on the show.
Yeah, no, that's great. And hopefully one day when there's another book that piques your interest, we'll be able to have you to come back to talk about another Star Trek novel.
Anytime.
Yeah. And I really, like I mentioned before, I really enjoyed facilitating the Trek Book Club discussions. I get a lot out of it. And I would say, actually, now that I think about it, the Imzadi discussion, I mean, all the Trek Book Club discussions have been great, but I think the Imzadi discussion had a lot of participation, a lot of people chiming in at various points during that particular weekend in May. So, Matt, can you give us your contact information, how fans can continue the conversation with you, and if there's any other projects you're working on that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. I am still on Twitter. Twitter is having some growing pains at the moment. So I have moved some of my operation to Spoutable and Bluesky. I'm at Party Apocalypse on any platform. Search for me there and you'll probably find me. My website is partyapocalypse.com. It has my Trek podcast, The Holodeck is Broken, a number of other podcasts that I either produce or am on. Beyond the Cabin in the Woods, which is a horror movie podcast. Disorganized, a Criminal Minds podcast, if anyone's interested in that show. We did a show last year, Friendables, two friends talking about Hannibal Lecter, and another show, As the Myth Turns, which was a mythology podcast. A couple of years ago, we did a 13-part audio drama called The Fourth Wall, very informed by Deep Space Nine and a lot of that sort of stuff. It's ages ago, the wizard Merlin broke the borders between reality and fiction, and the world has to deal with that. And there's this base between fiction and reality called the Fourth Wall that has to deal with these issues of these two worlds bleeding together. And I've got my books on the website. We talked about time travel and that sort of thing. I've written a trilogy of novels about Orson Welles, the famed film director, trying to, I guess, when you think about it, my aesthetic was trying to adapt the Peter David style of weaving together all of these mythological threads. But instead of using Trek mythology, I was using the mythology of old Hollywood. So there's 3 novels there. Orson Welles' Mars, which is a time travel story dealing with the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast. The Devil Lives in Beverly Hills, which is sort of an eldritch horror story, but also a buddy cop story with Orson Welles and Charlie Chaplin fighting a demon. And the latest one, which was released about a year ago, The Once and Future Orson Welles, which deals with Orson Welles in the 70s searching for Excalibur, the lost sword of Arthur. And so those are all available on the website, partyapocalypse.com.
And the books are available like through your
Amazon.
website or through Amazon, or through like ebook format or
ebook
print format
and paperbacks.
Okay.
There's links on the website, but it'll link you to the Amazon pages, so it's available on Amazon.
Okay, great. All right, we'll take a look at that too then. Great. Well, thank you very much, Mac. For myself, you can contact me. I'm still on Twitter as well. It's at Peter Trek 1, the number 1. I have a short form Star Trek solo cast that's on Spotify called My Star Trek Life, that I just talk about various parts of Star Trek franchise. Just a reminder that you can contact the Trek Book Club on Twitter. We are at Trek Book Club. We read and discuss Star Trek books approximately once every 1.5 months over a discussion weekend. Just want to thank everyone for listening. Thank you, Mac, for joining. This is Peter signing off. Live long and prosper.